Good morning and welcome to the first of two videos on global ecology. Right now, um, this chapter is one that really talks about the biosphere and the ecosystems that exist here on Earth. All right. And although I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about human interactions with our ecosystems, I do think it's important that you know how ecosystems function because humans are part of those ecosystems and part of the biosphere. And we have a great deal of influence on the things that go on around us. All right, the water cycle, the carbon cycle, and so on. I don't want to get into the politics of climate change, uh, overpopulation, and that sort of thing. We'll talk a little bit about that in the next chapter's videos. But you do have to understand that we are part of the global ecosystem. All right. Now, you may recall this chart from the very beginning of the semester, and we haven't really looked at it in a long time because we spent a lot of time talking about organ systems, right? There were, uh, 8 or 10 chapters that were completely devoted to each individual organ system in the human body. And so the part that you see here in the middle on organ systems is this is the area that we've spent most of our time on. Now, we're going to skip over the organism, population, and community levels right now and move right to biosphere and ecosystems. In our next chapter, we'll go back to the idea of human population specifically and how we interact with the other living things around us. All right, so we're kind of jumping the gun a little bit, but we will come back to populations next time. Now, um, our main goal in this chapter is going to be to talk about the various ecosystems and their natures. How do they operate, and what are the differences between them? Before we get to that, however, we should probably define what the biosphere is, that top level on the diagram from the previous slide. The biosphere is, by definition, the regions of the Earth's waters, crust, and atmosphere that supports life, all right, that's inhabited by living organisms. Now, life does exist at the deepest part of the oceans. Life exists in almost every area of terrestrial or land based uh, areas, and it also exists to a small degree to a certain altitude in the atmosphere. All right, life certainly doesn't go above, a few thousand feet, but all of that is part of the biosphere. Now, by definition, an ecosystem is part of the biosphere, and there are several major ecosystems that we'll talk about in terms of existing on Earth. By definition, an ecosystem is a place where organisms interact between each other and their environment. All right. And so essentially, it's where we live. All right. Whether we're a plant or a fungus or a bacterium or a person, the ecosystem is where we live. Now, ecosystems come in a couple of different flavors, including terrestrial. And we are, of course, terrestrial organisms. We live on the land. That's what terrestrial means. And there are several different types of terrestrial ecosystems on Earth, including forests, grasslands, and deserts. All right. And we will well, first of all, they're defined or distinct based on how much rainfall they experience each year, as well as their average temperatures each year. The second major group of ecosystems are the aquatic ecosystems, and these come in two major flavors: freshwater and marine. All right. The freshwater are the lakes, the ponds, the rivers, streams, that sort of thing. And then the marine, of course, is the oceans. All right. Salt water. All right. So freshwater versus saltwater in terms of aquatic ecosystems. Now, the terrestrial ecosystems, as we said earlier, are essentially biomes, which is a fancy word for ecosystem, but they are defined by temperature and rainfall. And you can see several different examples of terrestrial ecosystems on the slide on the right hand side. You've got a temperate forest, which is composed of um, uh, trees that lose their leaves in the wintertime. You've got deserts, tropical grasslands, tropical rainforests, temperate grasslands, taiga, which is essentially cooler and characterized by evergreens, conifers, pine trees, and that sort of thing. And then tundra, which is tends to be cooler but very desert-like. So the three major ecosystems or types of ecosystems are forests, grasslands, and deserts. The forests come in three different flavors. Tropical rainforests tend to be hot and wet, lots of moisture, and tend to be very warm. Coniferous forests, taiga, are tend to be wet but cold. Okay, and you can see that on the slide on the right. And then temperate deciduous forests, which we, by the way, in Albany, live just on the border of a temperate deciduous and a coniferous forest. This is an area that tends to be cool and wet, and will actually the leaves lose. I'm sorry, the trees lose their leaves in the wintertime. So forests tend to be wet, um, and they tend to have different forms of trees depending upon their temperatures. Grasslands tend to be much drier than forests, um, and they come in two different flavors as well. There are tropical grasslands, like you find in the savannas of Africa, for example, which tend to be warm but fairly dry. There might be a rainy season, but generally speaking, throughout most of the year, it's fairly dry. Um, there are also temperate grasslands, like in the American West, where which we refer to as prairies, as opposed to savannas. And these tend to be cooler than the tropical ones, but again, not as much water, or not as much rainfall as the forests. And then finally, the driest of the terrestrial ecosystems are the deserts. And these are characterized by very little rainfall. And they come in two forms: deserts, which tend to be fairly tropical, very dry and warm, and tundra, which tend to be much cooler. They tend to be very dry, so trees won't grow, but you may get some small amount of small plant growth. Okay, now that moves us to the aquatic ecosystems. And as I said earlier, there are two major forms of aquatic ecosystems. All right, the first is or are the marine ecosystems. These are the oceans, um, and here you find the shores of the ocean, the beaches, and that sort of thing, the oceans themselves, as well as coral reefs and estuaries. Coral reefs are found in the water, but near the shore. You don't find coral very deep in the oceans. And estuaries are areas where um, fresh water runs into salt water. So, for example, where a river runs into an ocean, and you've got this mix of brackish water, not quite an ocean salt water, but not fresh either. And they support their very unique types of life. Now, freshwater is a little bit different. Um, Freshwater is what we find in the lakes, the ponds, rivers, and streams, and they support a whole different kind of ecosystem. Not that it's different in terms of the animals that you find there, but the animals themselves are very different. A freshwater fish, for example, is very different than a saltwater fish, especially in terms of how it has to osmoregulate, maintain its water salt balance. Living in a saltwater environment versus living in a freshwater environment poses very different physiological challenges. All right. So these are the major aquatic ecosystems. Now, as far as ecosystems go, there are several major components, things that we have to think about when we are, quote unquote, building an ecosystem or examining an ecosystem. The first one, or the first part, are what we call the abiotic aspects of the ecosystem, abiotic components. These are the non-living aspects of the ecosystem. So this includes the amount of rainfall, the temperature, the type of soil, the type of rock, um, the um, the air around that particular ecosystem. Right, all of the things that are not living but still can are part of the system itself. Then, of course, we move into the living aspects of an ecosystem, which we call the biotic components here. And these are the living critters or organisms a in an area, in a biome. We'll start at the lowest level of the food chain, which are the producers, the autotrophs. The word autotrophs mean that they can produce their own food. And so these are the photosynthetic organisms, the producers. They capture energy from the sun and use that energy to grow. Then we move to the next level, which are the heterotrophs. And these are the feeders. These are the organisms that eat other organisms. And we refer to them generally as consumers because they're consuming their food. They can't make their own food, they eat other organisms in order to obtain their food. These guys come in a couple of different types. We have the herbivores, which are ones that feed on plants and algae. So these are the vegetarians, if you will. Things like rabbits and cattle and other organisms that eat the plants. Then you have the carnivores, and the carnivores are the meat eaters. These are the organisms that eat other animals. All right. Um, so things like wolves and tigers and lions and so on. There are also omnivores, and this is the group that we fall into. These are organisms that eat both plants and animals. And if you've got yourself a well-balanced diet, you're eating a little bit of meat and you're eating some vegetables as well. Last but not least, you have the detritus feeders, and these are decomposers. They feed on dead things, right? Decomposing organic molecule. Now, where you fit uh, into this grouping is what's called your niche. All right, this is the role that a specific organism plays in an ecosystem, and a niche is defined by how an organism gets its food, what exactly it eats, and how it interacts with the other organisms in that particular biome. All right, and so there's a lot of information on this slide, but you've probably heard most of it before. All right. Now, one of the most important aspects of an ecosystem is how energy flows through that system. Remember that we always begin with solar energy. All right, let me move myself over here. But we always begin with solar energy, so energy from the sun. And so that's always the first stop on the food web. And the food web itself simply describes who eats whom. So the producers are capturing sunlight and they're using the process of photosynthesis to turn sunlight as well as water and carbon dioxide into sugars, food for themselves. All right. And they use that energy to grow. We call those organisms, of course, the producers. Now, the producers are then in turn eaten by the consumers. All right, and of course, some of the consumers are eating other consumers, but the primary consumers are the herbivores.
It's 11 o'clock.
Thank you, Jesus. And the secondary consumers are the carnivores. All right, and we've got an example of both of those in the little circle over here on the right. All right, the bunny rabbit is a herbivore, and the fox is a carnivore. Now, sooner or later, the plants will die. All right, they age out just like animals do, and the animals will die as well. All right, even the carnivores will eventually die, and they will be broken down chemically by the decomposers, fungi and bacteria and some other things, and returned to the inorganic. God damn it! There we go. The inorganic nutrient pool. Okay. Okay. Um, so, what does this all mean? Well, uh, we're looking at the various trophic levels. Right? These are all the organisms that feed at a particular link in the food chain. And the producers, the primary consumers, and the secondary consumers. But the one thing that you should take from this is that this is a pyramid. And the key here is that only about 10% of the energy moves from one trophic level to another. All right. So, for example, only 10% of the plant matter is eaten by the primary consumers, and only 10% of the primary consumers are eaten by the secondary consumers. All right. And so each level changes by 10% approximately. Now, if we look at this specifically in terms of a food web, you can see just how complex this food web actually is. You've got multiple organisms shown here, including some plants, which are shown on the left side. You've got leaves and fruits and nuts. And these things are eaten by animals like the deer, the rabbit, some of the insects, the birds, and so on. All right. And then the birds and the deer and the chipmunks are eaten by predators, the carnivores, including foxes and hawks and owls, and so on. And you can see just how complex the transfer of energy actually is. It's not a very simple thing. This guy eats this guy eats that, blah 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 blah. And it's not a line, a linear thing. It's much more of a web. All right, and the energy, again, with each of these transfers that's represented here, only about 10% of that energy gets transferred. We can also represent this as what we call a food pyramid. All right, and that really drives home this idea of a 10% transfer of energy from one level to the next. This is an example of an aquatic food pyramid where we start with the autotrophs. I like this slide because it illustrates the amount of matter that's given or exists in each level. In a typical food pyramid in this aquatic system, autotrophs, the plants, comprise about 809 grams per square meter of area. Okay. The herbivores represent 37 grams per square meter. All right. So obviously considerably less, an order of magnitude less. The carnivores represent 11 grams per meter square meter, and then the top carnivores are only 1.5 grams per square meter. All right. So in other words, there's a lot more plants than there are herbivores. There's a lot more herbivores than there are carnivores. All right. And again, this on average is a loss of 10% of biomass with each level that you ascend on this pyramid. Okay, so that, my friends, will bring us to the end of the first of two videos on global ecology. In the next one, we'll talk about some of the biogeochemical cycles. All right, so my friends, that concludes the first of two videos, and I hope you learned something.